I want to give you your first PowerPoint on the life of pi by looking at four really important symbols from that story and giving you a little bit of background about why I think these symbols are so important to the story. The life of pi is about a boy who creates his own reality. He creates his own religion from parts of other religions. He creates his own world out of the remains of a sunken ship. He creates his own imaginary friendship with a deadly carnivore, and he creates his own meaning out of meaningless suffering. The guy changes the essence of his world. He changes the essence of his religion. The first part of the book is a hint at how much he's going to have to recreate everything about himself so that he can survive. What does it mean that he creates his own religion? It might be because he needs to experience love from a world that shows him nothing but suffering. Since the essence of every religion is love for him, then when he adopts all these religions, he's basically covering himself with layers of affection, acceptance, understanding, and affirmation. And this is necessary. So pi, in a way, sort of becomes his own creator. Another background idea is the idea of interpreting reality. If we see reality as symbolized by this apple over on the right, and we see our understanding as symbolized by the light bulb over on the left, the medium in the middle is the way in which we interpret reality. You can put anything in the medium that you think helps you understand reality. Maybe it's books, maybe it's binoculars or microscope or a telescope. Maybe it's language, maybe it's music. It might be human beings like teachers or parents. It might be the internet. There are lots and lots of mediums. There are lots and lots of lenses through which we interpret the real world. Metaphors of the life of pi are symbols of this medium. Whether we're talking about water, names, spices, or zoos, they're all metaphors of ways in which pi interprets the real world. His name is used to interpret the world. Spices are used to interpret the world. Zoos, water, all of that. A medium doesn't just interpret the world. He uses the medium to change the world. What is reality? Typically, reality in our Western tradition is seen as something that exists in and of itself. It doesn't exist because of us. It exists regardless of us. Reality is deeper and older than human beings, and it's stronger. Reality is whatever you want to call it in detail. It's something that exists in and of itself. You might be able to explore it, but you can't really change it. The rules are there. The rules are in place. It has a solid foundational existence. The real question is, can we know it? Or is it beyond our understanding? Is it mysterious, or could it be understood? And how do we understand it? Do we understand it through empirical study or through abstract reasoning? Or do we understand it by using our imagination or by struggling spiritually? How do we understand reality? Do we understand it like a math problem, or do we experience it like love? What is reality, and what's our relationship with it? Sometimes reality can be defined as essence and nature of the thing. The idea of essences goes back to ancient philosophy in ancient Greece with what we would call essentialism. And that is the idea that every single thing has something that makes that thing what it is. And that if we understand that thing, if we can truly grasp the essence of that thing, then we can do anything we want with it. Over and against the idea of essentialism is a much newer idea, which is existentialism, the idea that nothing has an essence in and of itself, but that reality is either unknowable or malleable, that we can change it, or at the very least, we can't know its essence. As philosophy progressed over thousands of years, we've shifted from essentialism, this idea that everything has an essence, to existentialism, the idea that nothing really has an essence that we can know about or that we can use, but everything is either mysterious or that everything is somehow malleable and changeable and subject to our own power or will. The first metaphor that I want to look at in the story is the water. This is a very powerful metaphor in lots and lots of stories, and it means many things. It could be a symbol of the balance between life and death, It can be a symbol of the unconscious. There are many similar symbols throughout stories. When you see sky, fog, snow, or even amniotic fluid, that often is a reference to water, or water itself could be a reference to the womb. The sky, the fog, the snow, and often these things are connected. The symbolic function of water is really powerful because we can move around in it without really seeing it, and sometimes without even knowing it's there. Water is also constantly changing, and that has symbolic implications. It might be a person that's always changing, or maybe it's a symbol of the primal chaos from which the world was born. And water, like a symbol between life and death, has life and death potential. It's a cradle of life on our planet, but the ocean itself can be a very savage place where there's this constantly tumultuous food chain. Once you enter the water, you enter the food chain. My question in relation to the story is, can water become the world? Can water become the medium through which a new world is created? And you read the story, you can see that, yeah, that's exactly what happens. The ship sinks and a new world is born and created out of that. Another symbol that's really important is the name. Names are lenses through which we interpret ourselves and are interpreted by other people. And much of our lives are spent responding to the sound of our own names, exploring the meaning of our own names, and correcting other people's mispronunciation and misuse of our names. It's not a coincidence, I think, that in ancient myth, magical power was achieved through knowing the true name of something. That if you knew the true name of somebody, even a god, you could control the owner of that name. And James Fraser suggests that this is even a Stone Age tradition. So names are extremely important. And in myth, people are constantly trying to know and control others through the use or misuse of their names. They have a magical power over people. So if you can think of a name as a lens for understanding something, one way of thinking about the name is through essentialism, that the name represents the essence of the person. And that's certainly how people want to see and use each other. In the beginning of the book, Pie's name is associated with pool and with fish, but Pie's name is also seized by bullies in the school that want to say that his name actually means pissing. So when they see him, they remind him constantly, this is what your name means. Your name is pissing. And that means that that's all you are. And so Pie engages in a struggle early in the story for his name. And he re-identifies himself not as pissing, but as Pi, the mathematical symbol, whose numbers never repeat. And this is a very powerful moment because Pi has to seize control over his name and has changed his essence from being a boy who pisses to a boy that cannot be defined, a boy who is represented by a number that is mathematically very, very powerful and infinite. That Pi is essentially an infinite being that cannot be controlled and has, infinite potential, all of that. And the name become the person. My belief is that the name as a symbol in the story is a symbol for the lenses through which people can be interpreted. And it's really the lens itself that becomes the reality, that Pi's name becomes his reality. Pi changes his reality. He changes his essence. He uses his name to basically change himself. Zoo enclosure is another metaphor of the lens through which people see reality. But in this case, the zoo enclosure is really a habitat in which people live. Zoo enclosures are used in the story to show that people can change their essence by using their lenses of interpretation. What is a zoo enclosure and how does it work? In the story, Pi grows up in a zoo. He is the son of a zookeeper and he spends a lot of time observing how zoos work. He thinks that the zoo is sort of a microcosm of the world and that human habitats are a little bit like zoo enclosures. The zoo enclosure contains all the elements that are necessary for life in a small space. So if you want to make one, you have to look at the animal you want to take care of You want to think about what that animal needs and bring everything it needs into that small space. And then you have a zoo enclosure. So when you think about it, it seems to be that Pi is saying that everything has an essence, that what we need to do is grasp the essence of life and put all of those life needs into a small space. So if animals have needs for order and a clear demarcation of territory, then we can create an enclosure by putting all of those things into a small space and we can control the animal. So this is an essentialist argument that if I want to create a city for people to live in, or a school for children to learn in, or a space station for astronauts to do their experiments in, all I need to do is understand the essence of people. And then I just put all of the things that fulfill that essence into that small space, and boom, I have an enclosure. So that's an essentialist argument. But I want to suggest that Pi is actually not arguing that at all. That what he says, if you continue reading the book, is that the zoo enclosure changes the animal. It actually changes the essence of the animal. So how does it do that? Well, for one thing, confined animals live longer in zoos. Um, the nature which created the animal is not a nice thing to the animal. That what we do, or what zookeepers do, is they enhance the animal's existence and they allow it to thrive. The other thing that he observed is that animals change. They change their behavior that transcends what we understand of them. One thing that animals do is they invent other animals. A rhinoceros will become friends with a goat. Animals have very unusual behaviors when they're in zoos. Animals also, when they're released into cities, they adapt to the city environment. So their essence changes. And people are always inventing animals, what he calls the anthropomorphic animal. So his theory behind anthropomorphism is that animals aren't people at all, but we treat them like people, and then therefore the animals become people. If you're not sure what that looks like, just look at your dog. Your dog doesn't think of itself as a person, but it behaves like a person. Your dog has adapted itself almost perfectly to family life, and it is essentially one of the people in the family. And that's how everybody thinks of their dog, right? They think of their dog as a member of the family. They don't think of the dog as a wild animal at all. And the dog doesn't think of itself as a person, but it just thinks that all of its family members are dogs like itself. So how do zoo enclosures work in more detail? Well, for one thing, they provide safety. And for another thing, they provide the necessities of life. And in so doing, what they do is they calm the animal down and they diminish what he refers to as the flight distance, or the distance within which the animal wants to run away. The quote is this: "The key aim is to diminish the animal's flight distance. Our tools for diminishing flight distance are the knowledge we have of the animal, the food and shelter we provide, and the protection we afford." So zoo enclosures are not prisons. You don't stay in a zoo enclosure because you can't leave. They are places of freedom. You stay in a zoo enclosure because you have everything you need. And this idea of freedom can be applied not just to animals in zoos, but to people in all of their habitats. The limits that we complain about, that are defined by, for example, religion, or by school, or by all the institutions that we feel confine us, those limits, when they're set properly, are actually fulfilling. They make our lives more secure, pleasurable, and understandable, and that's why they exist. That's why we have schools. That's why we have religions. That's why we have social institutions. That's why we have these massive cities where millions of people come together and live. They don't come together because they want to be trapped. They come together because all of their needs are met in the most efficient way imaginable. So if zoo enclosures are working properly, they allow animals to become emotionally stable, stress-free, social, gentle, and reproductive. And the same thing can be said about human zoo enclosures, whatever they happen to be. This is related to his idea of confinement. That if we are to say that a zoo is a prison because it confines animals, what he would say is that animals need confinement. And he would say the same thing about people, that animals use their territory to confine themselves. example, they use urine and other secretions to mark their territory. They will defend their territory. And most interestingly, they create confinement in their relationships that animals typically look for others to control them. Not because they don't want to have any kind of independence, but because they want to have power. That deference to an alpha leader gives animals power. Animals don't fight because they're struggling for power. Animals fight because they don't know who the leader is. Once they see the leader, once they recognize their leader, they become very peaceful. Once they know their place, they understand where they belong, and they become very peaceful. So for animals, social rank determines everything about their lives. And what he calls the omega animals, so the animals down below on the social rank, are usually the most productive animals because they don't really have a problem with who's in charge. They know who's in charge, and they just get on with the business of things. So this is a very counterintuitive idea of leadership and dominance. It's the people that are clearest about where they belong that are the happiest and most productive. And the leader is not someone who takes over because they control, and they take over because everybody lets them take over. They take over because everybody's looking for a leader, and this gives them a sense of security. He also connects this with religion. He feels, because religion is a huge metaphor, it's a huge symbol in the story, he feels that people use religion in order to confine themselves as well. They use ethical systems to confine themselves. Zoos are like religions. Today they're very unpopular, but not because they're bad, just because people don't understand them. People associate religions and zoos with confinement, rules, and lack of freedom. But what he tries to explain is that freedom is actually achieved through constraints and rules, and that zoos and religions make people and animals more free. He comes back to the issue of violence. He says that when animals are violent and when they're dangerous, they are so when they don't have what they need or when they feel threatened. But once they have what they need and they don't feel threatened, all the violence diminishes. They're not really dangerous. He feels that religions are kind of like that a lot of people commit crimes in the name of religion. But this contrasts with his belief that religion is about love and compassion. Why do people act violently in the name of God? He believes it's because they don't really understand what religion is, and it's also because they don't really know their place in the world. So violent people are violent because they don't have what they need and they feel threatened. People are very much like animals. And that's really the message of the zoo enclosure, that enclosures are a source of freedom because they give people a sense of security, they help people understand where they belong, and they combine in a really efficient way all the means of meeting their essential needs. So the question I want to leave in relation to zoo enclosures is, can our manufactured environments change the essence of those who are in it? And the answer, I think, is yes. I think that the zoo enclosure changes the creatures that are in it. And I think the systems of confinement that we have, whether they're religions or ethical systems or institutional educational systems, they also change the essence of the people that are in them. Finally, the last lens that I want to look at, or the last metaphor of the lens I want to look at, is spices. The spice is a really important symbol in the story, and Pai spends a lot of time talking about food. Food is the essence of life. But given that, how important is spice to the experience of food? Spices make food more interesting. Even though food is helping our body, it's the taste of that is our experience of food. If you combine that with the texture of the food and all of those things, what we taste is how we experience the food. So the spice actually become the food. I think that the answer to that in real life is that's ridiculous. Of course not. That in theory, you should be able to eat food that doesn't taste like anything. You know, you should be able to put like an IV drip in your body and get all the nutrients and calories you need to keep going. Suppose we imagine a future in which our experience of food will be eliminated because we need food, but we don't necessarily have the time to eat it. But he seems to think that the spices are the most important thing. The taste of the food is probably even more important than, the essence of life that the food is. So what is the relation of food to art, if we're just making that connection? He thinks that storytelling is like cooking. The facts on which the story is based is the essence of the story. But if you just focus on the facts, then you have something which is boring and what he calls yeastless reality. So the story itself, it needs embellishments. It needs fascinating detail or lies, whatever you want to call it, to make the story more interesting. And the metaphor he uses is that an imaginative story is like a full, hearty, risen loaf, and that it is natural to invent a better story to make it more livable, because the reader will live in the story. So my question in relation to this is, can the story itself become more important than the reality on which it is based? And relating to storytelling and food is the idea of the storytelling being like a religion. He contrasts two types of people, the atheists and the agnostics. The agnostics are people that don't accept stories, and they only accept the dry factual reality. So when they look at the facts, they see that religion is nonsense. The atheists, what they do is they believe in an absence of God and do so faithfully and passionately, and they create their own religion of non-God. And Pi is much more impressed with that, with atheists than agnostics, because atheists actually create something like a religion, which is the firm, passionate belief in the absence of God. Whereas agnostics haven't accepted anything yet. They don't believe anything. Okay, and then finally, in relation to religion and spices, could religion be considered to be a spice? Well, if the physical symbols of religion, for example, are like rituals, artifacts, paintings, sticks of incense, and all of those things, these are things that actually help people practice their belief in their God. And so what they essentially do is they spice up their lives. It's one thing to have a conscious belief in a deity, but it's another thing to practice your belief. And that is the spice. The rituals and the symbols are the spice that make the religion enjoyable. And the question is, could religious symbols be part of the water with which we view reality? Could they be part of the lens through which we view reality? And could they actually change our reality? So somebody who practices the symbols of the religion, could their existence be different? And probably, I think the answer is yes. When we look at the next slideshow, I'm going to try to connect this to postmodernism. I'm going to suggest that The Life of Pi is really a story about how we use the lenses or the media of our interpretation of reality to change our reality. That's a big message of the story.